Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Whoever had me sitting there on the left wing of the table is truly a sick person. But anyway. Okay, so deeply flawed conservative arguments for carbon tax. Why is the thing, oh, there we go. So there are several or two main examples. There's the Climate Leadership Council proposal from a year or two ago, led by Ted Halstead and some Beltway heavyweights you all heard of. There's the recent proposal from Congressman Curbelo, supported by the people of the Niskanen Center. And then there's being developed an organization, Americans for Carbon Dividends, which I think is really not much more than a financing lobbying organization for the Climate Leadership Council. They plan to spend $10 million their first year. It involves a number of other Beltway heavyweights you've heard of, and they claim they aim to pass legislation after the next presidential race, which is kind of interesting in terms of who they hope to win that race in 2 years. Anyway, the typical proposal has the following components: a carbon tax starting at somewhere in the range of $24 to $40 per ton, which translates to about 21 to 34 cents per gallon of gasoline, rising typically, in the typical proposal, about 2% a year above inflation. The CLC wants to return all revenues, quote, to the American people as dividends. Ted Halstead says this makes the proposal revenue neutral. I'll come back to that point a little bit later. Congressman Curbelo wants to replace the federal fuels tax and spend it on subsidies for coastal states and for various other interests. Most of the proposals have a border carbon adjustment to maintain competitiveness between imports and exports, subject to and not subject to this sort of policy. The proposals typically have a reduction, the CLC proposal, or a temporary moratorium, the Curbelo proposal, but not an elimination of the existing greenhouse gas regulations. For the CLC, the Obama regulations; for Curbelo, whatever the Trump policy winds up being after the regulatory process plays itself out. But both proposals advocate a greater reduction in greenhouse gas emissions than under the Obama Climate Action Plan. Therefore, energy costs have to be higher. That is simply not avoidable. And they both claim they will yield policy predictability, which I'll come back to also. With respect to the insurance argument, they claim that we're facing a potential crisis. There's a small probability of a catastrophe in terms of climate phenomena. We need to buy insurance. And so the question then becomes, well, how much insurance are these proposals buying if we apply the EPA climate model? And for both the CLC and Curbelo proposals, the answer is about 3/100ths of a degree in the year 2100. Notice that the standard deviation of the surface temperature record is about 11/100ths of a degree. So the effect of these proposals would not be measurable. More broadly, just to continue on this insurance argument, if you take the entire Obama Climate Action Plan, you get, there's a goof up in this slide, you get 15/1000ths of a degree. If you believe that the U.S. pseudo-agreement with the Chinese is meaningful, it's not. You get another 10% reduction, another 1/100th of a degree. If you assume the Chinese reduce their emissions by 20%, you get another 0.2 of a degree, et cetera, et cetera. If you make a whole bunch of assumptions that are favorable to these policies, you wind up with a temperature reduction in the year 2100 of about 0.5 degree. That's what we're talking about in terms of the proposals being made by the international bureaucrats and elitists. So the insurance argument can't pass any plausible benefit cost test. It's simply preposterous as environmental policy under any set of plausible assumptions. The CLC claims their revenues will be returned as equal dividend payments to families of four, or to the American people. What that really means is the interest groups able to form a majority coalition in Congress. That coalition is going to change over time, obviously, and is going to be very different from Ted Halstead's families of four. The proposal ignores the relative influence of concentrated, unconcentrated pressure groups, industries, and geographic areas. bearing disproportionate tax burdens, they're going to have to be compensated in the congressional bargaining process. The argument that these revenues are going to be returned on an equal basis to all Americans, I think, is rather silly. The border tax adjustment is basically rebates for exports and fees imposed on imports to and from economies without comparable carbon pricing systems. It's not at all clear how this would be applied to economy imports from or exports to economies with regulations or subsidies, but without explicit carbon pricing. That would be a set of calculations, very complex and deeply politicized. There's the supply chain system. You know, you buy an iPhone from China, it has components from 20 or 30 countries, all of whom will have differing carbon emissions policies. I think this proposal is clearly unworkable. The CLC claims that the dividend policy will reduce the size of government because the carbon tax plus dividends is revenue neutral. I mean, that Ted Halstead, that isn't a display of crass dishonesty, shameless even by Beltway standards. You know, it's a new spending program. There's a tax plus the dividends. They're government taking money out of one set of pockets and putting it in a different set of pockets. In other words, it's an increase in resource allocation by government. That is an increase in the size of government. Moreover, both Halstead and Curbelo argue for a greater reduction in greenhouse gas emissions than under the Obama Climate Action Plan. That means energy prices would be higher, which means more government resource allocation. The border tax adjustment would require an enormous bureaucracy, you know, even if the greenhouse gas bureaucracy is reduced. The argument that this is going to reduce the size of government is just not credible. Then there's the broken windows fallacy. Halstead claims that this is going to be great for the economy because they're going to force substitution away from the existing energy and transportation capital stock and new investment in new technology. Well, that's the broken windows fallacy in all of its glory. You know, a broken window is great for the window repair guys. It's not good for the economy as a whole. If a carbon tax destroys the economic value of part of the capital stock, that's not good. And if it is good, then earthquakes and hurricanes are bullish. That's not something you want to say here in New Orleans. Just as an aside, the terms carbon and carbon pollution, I think, are political propaganda. Carbon dioxide is not carbon, and it's not a pollutant. You know, water vapor is responsible for most of the radiative properties of the troposphere. No one calls water vapor a pollutant. You know, why not? Because presumably it's because ocean evaporation is a natural process. Well, so are volcanic eruptions. But the massive amounts of sulfur and particulates emitted by volcanoes are pollutants by any definition. So I urge all of us to use the phrase greenhouse gases, not carbon, because it has the virtue of being scientifically accurate without implicitly assuming the answer to the underlying policy question. Halstead claims that there's a Treasury study that says under his carbon tax, the bottom 70% of the income distribution would come out ahead. He's simply lying about that. The Treasury study says explicitly that their analysis is static. It ignores changes in wages and employment caused by these energy taxes. The only thing it looks at are taxes and the carbon tax revenue payments. You know, more expensive energy caused by government policy means less employment and lower wages. It's just that simple because energy and employment are complements. They both claim, CLC and Curbelo, that the carbon tax would provide policy predictability for the private sector. Well, if you look at his proposal, Halstead calls for a blue ribbon panel after 5 years that might recommend an increase in the tax rate. Curbelo calls for a national climate commission that would set new goals for greenhouse gas reductions after 2025. That's what the Beltway defines as predictability. It's really quite amazing. You know, the only thing that's really predictable are the incentives driving behavior by these agencies. They are inexorably going to be pushing for climate policies broader and more stringent. Then there's the issue of the elasticity of the carbon tax revenues. Remember, I mentioned that under both of these proposals, the tax rate rises at 2% faster than inflation every year. Well, eventually it's going to yield declining revenues. just because of the elasticity of the function between revenues and the tax rate. And so how are the dividend payments or the subsidies going to be preserved when revenues start falling? Are the payments or the subsidies going to be cut by Congress? Good luck with that. Is the tax rate going to go down? Well, so much for predictability. Are there going to be new taxes, new revenue sources? So much for shrinking government. More borrowing, more debt? That's the inevitable outcome, I think, of this inexorable process. So anyway, both Halstead and Curbelo argue that in effect they're arguing, or they argue explicitly, that the regulation of greenhouse gas emissions inhibits economic growth, but a carbon tax that yields energy costs even higher would strengthen the economy. I mean, this is confusion, pure and simple. At a more general level, the list of low probability catastrophes is endless. Asteroid impacts, mass volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, tsunamis, mass contagion, the terrorist use of bioweaponry, nuclear war, gamma ray storms, massive, ad infinitum. Are we going to spend 1 or 2% of GDP on every one of them? No, we're not. And so I think at a pure, narrow, bloodless benefit cost level, these proposals are unworthy of any serious consideration. So thank you very much.